we tend to settle. And what I mean by that is we as humans, we as believers, even just people, we tend to tolerate a lot of things in our life that if the truth were to be told, if we would see them to be pretty damaging things. And then if we could see that, we might be a lot less tolerant of those things in our lives. Even as believers, as disciples, we tolerate things. Behaviors, attitudes, and what I'm going to call petty sins. What is the effect of petty sins if they get in your life? That's an interesting question we're going to talk about today. We tend to look at sins on a continuum, right? There's a range of sins. What I mean is there's big bad ones over here, and then there are sins that are less bad, and then there are some that we almost look at as harmless sins, to the point we sometimes wonder, are these even sins at all? But the thing is, as disciples, Jesus will at different times, while we follow him, turn around and ask us to deal with that thing. We have tended to tolerate whatever that thing is. We've tended to tolerate it for so long, we hardly notice it. We find it strange that he would notice it. But the thing is, that thing might be more harmful and less innocent than at first glance. Go to our verse today in 1 Peter chapter 4. Peter's going to have some truths in this verse that relate to this idea. 1 Peter 4:15. This verse is in a section that talks about the broader topic of suffering as a Christian, which can range far and wide as far as what kind of suffering. We may have a particular kind of suffering in mind as we read through what he says, but I would encourage you, keep an open mind in that department. We've encountered suffering in this section, like being insulted, being shamed. So you might have just that kind of suffering in mind, but maybe there's a bigger field of suffering that we might want to open up and think about as we read, particularly our verse, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 15. If you suffer, it should not be as a murderer or thief or any other kind of criminal, or even as a meddler. As a human being, we understand almost intuitively, I want to say, that if we do wrong, it should hurt. Something should come back to us if we do what's really wrong. It should not feel good. Now, I realize across the broad spectrum of humanity, everywhere, we struggle to agree on what falls in the category of real wrong and what does not. But if you take something that's generally agreed upon to be wrong, like murder, if we do that, we have a sense of understanding about us that if we do that, it should hurt us. We should have consequences of some sort. Maybe we should be punished by the rest of mankind, or maybe God should strike us with a curse or something. It should hurt. If we do real wrong, we should suffer. Most human beings have that idea. And it is, in fact, a sense of justice. Or, I hate to say karma, because karma has a lot of bad connotations, but some people think of it in those terms. If you do something bad, you should feel the results of that. And being Christians or believers, hopefully we have an even stronger sense of that in our own lives. If I do wrong, I should have some kind of suffering for doing wrong. But like I said earlier, we have this scale of things as far as wrongs or sins. Most of us agree with the big bad things, murder, abuse. But you move down the spectrum into the middle, You move down in the spectrum very far, and you get into areas where we see things that are kind of middle of the road, gray, if you will, some people call them. And for things in the middle of the spectrum, we might think, yeah, that's called a sin in the Bible. I get that, but I don't see it causing harm. Maybe the hurt or the suffering that we think should follow something that's genuinely sinful isn't always there. And maybe sins in this middle area, we as Christians stay away from these, but the world doesn't because, well, the hurt doesn't naturally follow all the time. Maybe you could think about unfaithfulness in marriage. Good example. The world, by and large, doesn't see a problem with that anymore. It doesn't see it as hurting the participants. And so the line between right and wrong in their eyes is different than ours, certainly in right and wrong that they will participate in. Nobody gets hurt, they might say, and so, okay. And if I go out and I get stoned or drunk, no harm really. They might say that too. The world might. We as believers might question, well, where is your line? That age-old line between right and wrong. But we've got a line too. And maybe it's in a different place. But like I said at the beginning, we still tolerate stuff. We see the scriptures pointing out things that, quite frankly, we think, that's pretty harmless. And Peter in the verse today tackles that, but look at what he does. He takes two big sins at the very bad end of the spectrum, murder and theft, two commandments. And then he puts this general category next of evil, being evildoers, any kind of criminal activity, what the ESV calls any kind of evildoer, like he's talking about a whole bunch of stuff, murder, theft, a whole bunch of stuff. In the middle, kind of on the high end, we would say. And he tells us we should not suffer for that as believers because we shouldn't be involved in it, which we understand. We shouldn't be doing any of that stuff. It should hurt us if we do evil. God should smack us with a stick or something. But then Peter does something really pretty unsettling when you think about it. He jumps to the very bottom of the spectrum for some of us, and he puts a very petty sin in there, meddling. Meddling. Well, shoot, preachers meddle. Peter, what'd you go and put that in there for? That's petty. Yeah, it may be annoying to people, but it's hardly worth suffering for doing it. No harm, no foul, a lot of us might say. But here's the thing, and please, do not see this list as all-inclusive. I mean, just the fact that he puts a general category in the middle of the list should tell you he's not thinking he's listing everything. Any kind of evildoer, any kind of criminal. Okay, I get that. But meddling isn't even hardly wrong. But Peter is putting meddling in there as an example of something in the petty category. Please hear this. You can suffer for your petty sins. What? You can suffer for your petty sins. You can hurt yourself in what you tolerate in your own self. You might say, well, you can meddle and no policeman is going to come drag you off. Yeah. But that suffering may not be necessarily suffering in the way of punishment for doing the thing. At least not punishment that way. You could say the same thing about many other petty sins and behaviors, right? No law enforcement is going to haul you off if you worry. Peter puts meddling in there as an example of something that we tolerate. But you can put any other petty sin or behavior in there. Put your own in there. As a Christian, you could, but you shouldn't suffer for that petty sin. Well, most of the time I don't, you might say. Meddle and have some fun. And maybe you should question that. We understand as believers that we should avoid evil. And Paul says even the appearance of evil. Live such good lives among the pagans. That's what Peter said earlier. That sounds like same idea, avoid evil of any kind. But Peter went way too far this time, far into the spectrum. There's a lot of people that would argue, well, meddling isn't even a sin at all. You look out the window and see what your neighbor's doing. That's not a huge sin. That's kind of the point, though, isn't it? Even the petty stuff can cause you to suffer. You put your petty sin in there. What is it? I don't know. I often pick on worry because so many of us do it and tolerate it, but open up the category. Think of the other things that you tolerate. Do they ever cause you suffering? Well, the cops haven't shown up yet. Yeah, but is that the only kind of suffering possible for that thing? Let's take worry just as a working example, but don't limit it to worry any more than limiting it to meddling. But take worry. If you worry, do you ever suffer for it? Oh yeah, now you're meddling. No, do you ever suffer for your worry? The suffering that happens with worry, and maybe more of the petty sins, isn't that the law comes after us, or that God gets out his punishment stick, but we hurt ourselves. If we worry, what kind of suffering do we take into ourselves? Think about it. Well, we lose our trust in God. We give in to fear. We live in that fear. We lose sleep at night. We give ourselves ulcers. Boy, when you think about it, we open ourselves up to all kinds of suffering with that little sin of worry. Why? Well, because we tolerated a petty sin, because we thought it's not that big of a deal. But look, pick your petty sin and put it in Peter's list. It's way too easy to pick someone else's, so don't do that. Pick your own. Come on, I bet you $5 you got one. Mine's gambling. No, I'm just kidding. Put your petty sin in Peter's list. Do it. Worry, meddling, gossip, poor treatment of other people, being short with your spouse, laziness, secularness, seeking attention. Oh, yeah. You might be saying, well, Steve, some of those aren't even sins. That's the thing about the stuff at the lower end. A lot of it, the pettiness of it makes it pretty debatable, but it brings suffering into our lives. And it's not the local sheriff kind of suffering. What about hedonism? What about gluttony? Oh boy, he's meddling now. The point is, these can bring suffering into your life. They can affect your relationship with God. They can affect your relationship with other people, and not for the better. They can affect the state of your heart, and yet you tolerate it. They can affect the state of your soul, yet you tolerate it. You say, well, this is okay. Is it really? Peter's saying you should not suffer as believers for any of these things. You should have the presence of God inside and weed out that petty junk and not suffer for it any longer. Even when getting down to these things that people might say, but no harm, no foul. Even getting down to those things, we can say, would Jesus weed this out? And has he been talking to me, tapping me on the shoulder in my spirit? Is this a tolerated petty sin? Am I suffering for it? Do I want free of the suffering? We put far too many things in the category of it's not a sin, therefore it's okay. And then we live with the suffering and the damage. And I'm not even going into the area of bigger things like forgiveness and love and things he talked about like that. This is petty stuff. But even there, suffering is possible. You might know that for years I chewed tobacco. This was back in the 1980s. I justified it as not being a sin, and I tolerated it. But I suffered for tolerating it. I was short with my wife half the time because I was edgy. I was impatient to satisfy that craving with another dip. I was turned into myself. I was satisfying this desire that I had, and I suffered. I had a heart that was damaged by addiction, and I tolerated it for years. And because I tolerated this petty sin, or even not a sin, if you want to be so careful about labels, because I tolerated this, I suffered. I was in bondage, carrying a burden of this thing. I was serving myself. My soul was not healed, and it was not whole. Our petty sins, the things that we tolerate in our life, they can make us suffer. They strain our connection with God. They hurt our connection with other people. They get down into our heart and soul and do damage. The things that we think are innocent are relatively so. They bring about a heart focus on self. That brings damage in us. Watch out for what you tolerate. And especially watch out for what you tolerate that Jesus talked about. And you think, no big deal. Jesus said, don't be anxious, do not worry, and yet we tolerate it. Jesus said, don't try to accumulate possessions, and yet we do. He was not being mean. He was not being restrictive. He was trying to save us from suffering. Look at the rich young ruler. He was suffering. Why? Because he had so much. How was that suffering? Well, having those things, we would say that's not even a sin. Yet he suffered greatly. Why? He could not follow Jesus when Jesus called. See, the suffering can grow until it becomes a fence between us and Jesus. And we're separated from him. And our connection with him is hurt. Even something like that. And then when that happens, that may as well be a huge sin for all the damage that it does and the suffering that it causes. I said in a past message that God is not out to make you suffer necessarily. In this area, I would go all the way to the other end of the spectrum and say, God is out to remove some, even if you can't call them sins, some pitfalls from your life that bring their own suffering. Well, so what? If there is something that is petty, but is in your life, something that you might struggle to even label a sin, would you let God reveal to you the damage of that thing, whatever it is? Would you be open and honest before God and let him reveal to you what this petty thing is? See, sometimes it's really hard to be open to his moving in that area because these kinds of things have sometimes gone through amazing amounts of justification on our part. Oh, that's not a sin. It's okay. So-and-so does that, and he's a great Christian. Put yourself before God. Let him point out to you what he came to save you from, even if it's small. Because you can suffer from that, and you don't have to. That petty thing, it can still grow into a burden. That behavior, that habit, what is it for you? Would you be open to letting him show you? It may not be a sin, but you can still let it go. Jesus calls you. Jesus chooses you to be his disciples, and he asks you to follow him and be his apprentice. As you follow him, you give him access to your life. You let him have his way with you. You give him full access into your heart, the deepest parts. And he might point out the things that you've held on to that have brought their own hurt into your life. And sometimes he'll point out that stuff, well, it isn't bad. And he'll tell us to let it go as we follow him. And he may do that so that we can take hold of something that's better. Spend some time letting him do that. Being open to him and just listening. You can give the power of his Spirit to do that, to let it go. You know, if you want to make a commitment to follow Jesus, he'd love it. And he can help. And he can relieve some suffering that you may not have realized you were carrying. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you. Thank you that you walk with us, and by your Spirit you give us the strength to cast things aside that we don't need, that hurt us. Help us not to be so incredibly legalistic that if it's not a sin, we carry it. Or even if it's a small sin, we don't work on it. Let us be open to you, to bringing freedom, the truth into our lives, and freeing us from suffering that we have. Show us how that might play out and what thing we may need to let go of. I pray that we will be open to that as time goes on. Better disciples, more closely following and listening. I pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.